Hello, I'm Jordan, and this is Andalusia Knits, my YouTube channel where I talk about all things knitting. And today I want to have a discussion about socks and how to make them last longer. Now, I kind of have a strange relationship with hand knit socks because on the one hand, I knit the same very utilitarian basic sock over and over again. I have so many pairs of socks that are basically the same pair of socks. But at the same time, these socks are also some of my most loved, most worn, and most cherished knit items because they are so practically useful. There are so many things that I knit that are nice to have but are not necessities, but socks are not one of those things. Whether I'm making socks myself or I am buying them somewhere else, I have to have socks. That is an essential. That's something that I got to have, and I really appreciate and really love that even though they are kind of, pragmatic and boring, it is something that I have to have that I'm able to provide myself. That's just a great feeling. It's the best feeling as a knitter, I think. But the bad thing about hand knit socks is that even when you use good materials, even under the best of circumstances, it is so hard to keep socks in good working order. It seems like they wear through so quickly. And while it is true that any sock you buy, it's going to wear out eventually. If your socks are wearing out in a matter of weeks or months, that is way too soon. So for example, I have socks here that I've had for years at this point, and while they might look a little worse from wear, they are still going strong and they still have no signs of holes. And so today in this video, I want to take a look at the 3 things that I think are most important to longevity in terms of socks. And I'll go ahead and give you a trigger warning right now. The first one is going to be a little rage-inducing. I promise it's not rage bait. That and all of the other tips I'm going to share today are things that I actively still do in my own socks and that I believe are contributing to the longevity of those socks. Okay, let's start off with the controversial tip. Let's get everyone pissed off right away. And my first suggestion for knitting socks that last is to skip the superwash sock yarn and go for non-superwash wool instead. And so let's break down why I feel this way. So typically these days, you will find a lot of yarn that is marketed specifically as sock yarn. And the blend of fibers that you get in this sock yarn is almost always going to be superwash merino wool and a little bit of nylon. And so superwash merino wool is wool that has been treated and is safe, quote unquote, safe to throw into the washer, which is a topic for another video, but it's machine washable wool. And then the nylon is in there because the process of creating the wool to be machine washable really weakens the fibers, and nylon is super duper sturdy. And so the nylon acts as a reinforcer to the weakened superwash wool. And while I don't have any qualms with nylon, I love a good synthetic, which is another controversial thing, I think, probably. I love nylon. It is a wonder fiber, but my issue with sock yarn is not the nylon, it's the superwash wool. Because even though the nylon is super duper strong, I find that superwash treated wool to be just so much weaker and so much more prone to wear and tear than non-superwash traditional wool. And so I knit my socks in non-superwash wool, and I don't have the luxury of nylon to keep them reinforced. And so instead I use the power of felting. And so felting is basically in an animal fiber yarn. Whenever the fibers get really condensed and locked into one another, it creates a felted fabric. So if you've ever seen somebody accidentally put a wool sweater in the wash and they pull it out and it's like baby doll size now, that is felting. The fibers have condensed, the air has been pushed out of the fibers, and they've really locked in together. And while sometimes it's a bad thing, like when you accidentally put a sweater in the washing machine, it can be a good thing in in cases like socks because that felted fabric is much more reinforced, is much more sturdy than just a plain knit fabric. And so the absence of the nylon is compensated for by the fact that the fabric felts as you wear these socks. And so I have some examples of this felting, and the good thing is that at first it doesn't take place on the outside of the sock. Now over time it's an inevitability, like a felted fabric is going to felt everywhere eventually. But as you can see, like the felting it's not too noticeable yet on the outside of these socks. And at this point, some of these socks are a few years old, so they've had a pretty good run so far. But so it looks pretty normal on the outside, but then if you flip these babies inside out, you will see, especially around the heels and the toes, where you take a lot of tension as you wear the socks, that they have started to create this felted fabric. Now, I don't know in this lighting if you can see exactly, but here and then here, down here on the heel, has started to felt. And let me grab another one that has really gone crazy. Now, this pair of socks is the most recent pair of socks I've knit, but it has also felted the fastest. It's the exact same brand, the exact same yarn as most of these other socks that I've knit, but for whatever reason, it is felting like crazy. I don't know. Don't know what's going on here, but you can see, especially here at the toe, that it has really gone felty. And I love this because my tendency for socks is they like to wear out in the big toe area. And I'm not sure, like, I keep my toenails trimmed. I'm not sure if it's like a shaping issue or what, but I'm always developing little gaps and little holes in the big toe area first. But not on these suckers, because that big toe area has really felted. And that felt will help reinforce those areas and keep things from developing holes. Now, eventually, even a felted fabric is going to fail. Like, it's a biological material. Wool comes from a living thing, so it's going to break down eventually. But it really helps a lot in terms of keeping your socks hole-free for years. Like I said, this yellow pair I've had probably the longest. It's like 3, 4, maybe 5 years old at this point, and it's still going strong. Now, it is starting to develop a little hole near the big toe, even where it has felted, so I'm going to have to do something about that eventually. But yeah, like, oh, woe is me, I only got 5 years of wear out of this sock, and it's all thanks to felting. Honestly, like, I know it's a controversial move, and the reason it's controversial is not so much the felting itself, but the fact that because these are non-superwash socks, I do have to wash these by hand just to make sure that I can ensure that the felting is not happening everywhere and it's not happening too fast. But that being said, while they are hand washed, socks are the easiest thing to hand wash. I basically do the same thing for my hand wash socks that I do for regular socks. A regular pair of socks I'm going to throw in the washer and forget about. And a hand knit pair of socks I'm going to throw into a pot of really hot water and forget about. Now, granted, I am going to have to come back later and like pull them out of the soap and the water and like wring them out and lay them flat to dry. But at this point, like I've developed a system. Like it takes all of 5 minutes to fill up the pot to wash them, and it takes all of 5 minutes to like pull them out and wring them out and lay them flat. So I've made peace with the felting at this point. And if you find that even your nylon reinforced socks are wearing thin faster than you want them to, I would really highly suggest giving non-superwash wool. Just try it for one pair. You don't have to like convert immediately like I have. Like now I do all my socks basically in non-superwash wool, but just give it a try with one pair and see if you get better results with the felting. And I really do think that you will get better results with the felting. Okay, we've got the controversial tip out of the way, and hopefully these next few tips will sound a little bit more reasonable by comparison. And so the second thing that will help your hand knit socks last longer is to knit them at a gauge that is denser than you probably think needs to be knit, and denser a gauge than you're probably being told to be knit. So these days, most patterns will have a suggested gauge for the number of stitches per inch you should be getting to make the object in the correct size. And similarly, most yarn labels these days will have a suggested gauge based on how big a particular yarn is. And while there aren't any like legally binding standards or anything, like over the years, like some standards for like a DK weight yarn needs to be knit at a particular gauge, and a worsted weight yarn needs to be knit at a particular gauge, and those sorts of standards have sort of naturally developed over time, but it's kind of still a little hit or miss, a little wild west in terms of the suggested gauge sizes. And personally, I find that the suggested sizes, especially on yarn labels, are just not dense enough to create socks that last. And so density has to do with maintaining your socks, because the reason that the yarn starts to wear thin is because when the yarn is spun and all the fibers are twisting together in the same direction, that creates a lot of durability. But as the individual fibers sort of wiggle their way out of that arrangement of being all twisted together, that is when you start to get weak points, because they're no longer bearing the brunt of your weight as a unit. They're bearing it on individual fibers, and that's what is going to start to wear through your yarn as you wear your socks. And so a dense gauge prevents that, because the wear and tear comes from like the stitches wiggling next to their neighbors. If they have no room to wiggle at all, there's no wiggling that's going to happen. And so the denser you can get your gauge, the less shifting between the stitches you will have, which means over time just less wear and tear, because there's less opportunity for the stitches to come out of that spun configuration and have to bear weight individually or as a smaller group. So if the suggested gauges these days are not good for sock knitting, what is a good gauge for knitting socks? And I think it depends on the size yarn you want to use. So my personal approach these days, most of my socks get knit in sport weight yarn as opposed to fingering weight sock yarn. And so when I'm doing these sport weight socks, I am aiming for a gauge of 7 to 8 inches, which is actually a more traditional gauge for fingering weight yarn. So basically, I guess the rule of thumb would be like go down a yarn weight to find your gauge. So sport weight yarn, I'm aiming for 7 to 8 inches. If I do, every once in a while, I will break out some fingering weight yarn to knit socks. And when I do that, I'm aiming for somewhere closer to 9 to 10 inches. And that gauge is exactly the reason that I don't knit a lot of fingering weight socks anymore, because I just don't have a lot of patience for 10 stitches per inch knitting. That's just a little too, that's just a bridge too far for me personally. But like I said, if you're wanting to make non-superwash fingering weight socks that last, I absolutely would suggest going down to a gauge that extreme. And so like I said, that's just a little too much for me. So I'm very happy to stay in sport weight land, where the gauge is a little bit more reasonable at 7 to 8. And because it is sport weight yarn, the socks I create are a little bit thicker than your average hand knit socks. So if you've knit a bunch of fingering weight socks before and you try a sport weight pair, just be prepared. There is going to be a little bit of extra thickness, but it's not going to be so thick that it should like impede your ability to like get these in your shoes. Or at least for me personally, I did not have any issue. Like it feels a little bit more snug in my shoes, but it doesn't feel like uncomfortable. I think if I went up to like a DK weight yarn, it would probably start to feel uncomfortable, but in the sport weight range, it just feels very like full and very sturdy. I really like the thickness, because that sort of gives me more confidence in their durability as well. So finally, I want to talk today about the fit of your socks. And this is one place, strangely enough, where I don't have a lot of qualms with the conventional sock knitting wisdom. It's pretty popular to hear people say that you want your socks to have between 10 and 15% negative ease. And I would generally agree with that, that range. So for those who are unfamiliar, negative ease basically means that the size of the sock is smaller than the actual measurements of your foot. And that is important to create a sock that stretches tightly over the surface of your foot and doesn't like bunch or twist. Because that bunching and twisting that you get in loose socks is going to lead to additional wear and tear. And so while knit fabric is a very stretchy fabric, it has a direction to that stretch. It wants to stretch left to right and it wants to stretch up and down. But when you have like a sock in your shoe that's like getting all bunched and twisted up, it's stretching in directions that it doesn't necessarily have a lot of stretch in, which is creating more tension, which is going to fray and wear down those fibers in the yarn over time. And so it really is important. I'm kind of a stickler now these days for knitting my socks that fit really, really well on me. And so for me personally, I find that about 12% is where I tap out in terms of negative ease. I find that any more and the sock starts to feel a little too tight, it starts to feel uncomfortable. And honestly, there is a point that you can knit the socks so tight that it's going to wear them down faster because the fibers are being pulled apart, they're being stretched so much. So like I said, anywhere between 10 to 15, but 12 is about my sweet spot. I have socks from the time before I was a big stickler about size, and it's really strange because they develop holes in places that you don't expect. They develop holes in the places where they bunch and twist in weird ways, and not in the places where you would normally wear out. So in my socks that fit correctly, I get a lot of wear in the toes, in the heels, which is what you would expect. But in my socks that were way too big and bunched up and didn't fit right, I would get a ton of holes like on the bottom of the foot. And since I've started knitting socks that fit correctly, like I have never had this like bottom of the foot problem anymore. And I think it's simply because that is just a place where when I wore them that it would bunch up and stretch in ways it shouldn't. And that just wore it out faster than the other places where the sock fit better on me. Now, in terms of specific advice for getting a good fit on the pair of socks that you're currently working on, there are so many different techniques for constructing socks that is a question that warrants an entire video series of its own. And so I will point you towards the person who I go to for my sock advice, and that is Roxanne Richardson, and she is another knitter here on YouTube. And at this point, she has years worth of technique videos on socks, and she has covered basically every construction under the sun. And so if you want to know how to make a very specific sock construction fit better for you, she is the lady to find. And so I believe she has created a playlist with all these sock videos in it. And if she hasn't, I will make one myself, and I'll put that link in the description below so that you can search through like her literal years of videos to find the specific heel construction or toe construction or whatever that you're looking for that will give you some better tailored advice for the specific kind of sock you're knitting. Alrighty, well I think that's going to do it for our sock knitting discussion today. If you made it through the video all the way, I really appreciate it. If you found some tips that you want to try out on your next pair, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up on the video as well. And if you like knitting content in general, I would highly suggest you subscribe to the channel so that you never miss an upload from me. But with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and say bye, and I'll see y'all in the next one.